Welcome to today's recording studio, Stephanie's office. I appreciate her letting me use that so I could make this video for you guys. So today we're going to talk about the unsung hero of the body, the lymphatic system. We're not quite yet to immune system, so there's some things that you will learn more about specific jobs and how the immune system works, but they're kind of linked. They go a little bit hand in hand. We're going to talk about the function, lymphoid organs, and specific tissues like the spleen, the thymus, lymph nodes, tonsils, and more. So starting us off, what is the lymphatic system? Like I said, it's the unsung hero of the body. You never really hear about, all the things that the lymph system is doing, and it's gathering all these fluids and it's doing all this stuff and recirculating tissues. It's really important. It's a series of its own vessels and ducts that carry excess tissue fluid, which is referred to as interstitial fluid. It filters it, it adds good things back to it, and reintroduces it to the bloodstream. It's really awesome. It's part of the immune system, but two separate parts as well that are working together all the time. So part one being a system of ducts, meaning little ways that things can get in and out as needed, and fluid lymph. So the fluid from plasma that leaks out into the interstitial spaces, that fluid gets absorbed or taken into the lymph vessels, basically. I'm going to go over all this in detail in just a second. But once it is in the lymph system, it is now called lymph fluid, even though it's fluid essentially that came from plasma. So it kind of gets confusing, but that's where that delineation is. So the system picks up that leaked fluid from the capillaries from the plasma into tissue fluids or interstitial spaces, and lymph ducts carry lymph to the blood vessels that are actually near the heart, and it's eventually put back into the bloodstream with some really cool stuff that happens in between. Part two of the system is lymphoid organs and tissues that work as, like I said, part of the immune system to prevent infection and viruses and diseases, etc. So those are considered your lymph nodes, spleen, thymus, tonsils, and the GALT or the GALT, which is gut-associated lymph tissue. Functions, 4 important functions of the lymphatic system. So overall functions. Function number 1 is to remove excess tissue fluid, because if that doesn't happen, then that fluid would be stuck in this interstitial spaces, would kind of fall down like with gravity and would result in edema. That picture there is a Doberman with edema in that rear right leg of fluid accumulating in that interstitial space or that tissue space. Function number 2 is waste material transport. So we know that all the time that there is cell metabolism. We've talked about it with muscles and then how there's waste products or byproducts of different systems. Well, tissues and organs do the same thing. So that is able to be picked up by the lymph and taken away as well. Function number 3 is filtration of lymph. Lymph passes through lymph nodes, and that's kind of where that takes place. Number 4 is protein transport. It's really cool, but proteins that are too large to go back into systemic circulation by way of capillaries and enzymes and other things like that, they can actually be transported and dumped into the heart to get back into the bloodstream by the lymph system. I'm going to reference each one of these functions on the next few slides so you can help kind of make that connection and understand it. Okay, so the next few slides are lymph circulation. So just a little bit more detail of kind of the whole process and what's going on. So I've talked to you guys before about the fact that vessels are porous. So vessels in general are porous, but vessels that are larger, remember, they break down into smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually way out in the tissues comes these capillaries. These capillaries are also very porous. And the reason for that, the reason why it's like that is because tissues are living things also, and they don't have their own vessels necessarily to feed them. We know that blood takes the nutrients and oxygen and all that stuff that has to happen for tissues to stay living. We know that is needed, obviously, by the tissues. So the process of this is designed for fluid from the plasma comes out and essentially washes the tissues and then provides the tissue cells with hormones that travel through the bloodstream, oxygen, nutrients to be able to do their job and actually just stay alive. So fluid enters and leaves the tissue space, goes back and forth. It goes out because of blood pressure from the heart beating, but it actually kind of gets sucked back in by osmotic pressure and concentration gradient. So basically, if it's not equal on both sides, it tries to correct that homeostasis I've talked to you guys about before and make it even. So it'll pull a little bit back in. So blood pressure is stronger and harder than the osmotic pressure or that concentration gradient that's flowing back in. So what happens? So if it's the heart blood pressure is pumping it out and we're not getting it all back in at the same rate, we're going to have some fluid accumulation. So those tissues, if nothing's happening to that, there's that edema, like that picture I just showed you on the last slide. So now bring in the lymph system. So function number one that I referenced, so excessive interstitial fluid or tissue fluid, it actually, the capillary vessels or the vessels on the lymph, they are bigger than the capillary vessels. So fluid that can't make it back in time actually gets brought in by concentration gradient into the lymph vessels, the really tiny ones that are out there. I mentioned before, once that plasma fluid or interstitial tissue fluid at that point gets into the lymph vessels, it is now referred to as lymph fluid. So those lymph capillaries, they end up joining, it's kind of like a reverse bloodstream. So it gets into bigger and bigger and bigger lymph vessels. And it's really cool because those lymph vessels, they utilize one-way valves to help prevent it from backing down with gravity and falling down, and body movement, so squeezing and pressure to move things along. Fun fact, those vessels of the lymph system, that's hard to say a lot of times, they actually have no muscles in their walls, unlike the circulatory system where those vessels have smooth muscle and they're actually contracting and pumping along. So the lymph vessels strictly rely on body movements and those one-way valves to move that lymph around. So that's pretty cool. This picture here is showing arterial end, venous end. So that's kind of where that happens. And then the capillaries. So that's where the fluid kind of comes out into the tissue, and near it, running along major vessels, etc., or minor vessels, I guess, also, are those lymph capillaries. And so that fluid gets picked up from the tissues. So the lymph fluid, so now it's going to travel through these lymph vessels to begin its cycle. And as it goes along, it actually is going to pass through at least one lymph node. We're going to talk about lymph nodes when we talk about lymph organs in just a minute. But basically, you guys kind of know what a lymph node is. If you get sick, they get swollen, they're in your neck, they're all over the place. So as that fluid passes through the lymph node, it's going to pick up lymphocytes. If you've taken hematology, you probably feel pretty confident about it, but you should have watched the blood lecture already, so learned a little bit about lymphocytes. But basically, in a nutshell, lymphocytes are a type of white blood cell that shows up last in an infection. I have a picture of one on here, so they're very circular. This white blood cell in the center have this very large nucleus. Their main job is to facilitate specific immune responses. So basically what that means, depending on the kind of lymphocyte that it is it shows up last because it's the other cells are, to reduce inflammation and phagocytize and eat those microinvaders, etc. But the things that are there, lymphocytes can mark them for either destruction by other cells or create an antibody. So that underneath is the next part. So although identical under the microscope, there are two types of lymphocytes, T cells and B cells. And sometimes you'll hear them referred to as T lymphocytes or B lymphocytes, or T cells and B cells, but they're referring to the same thing. So T cells mark antigens for destruction by other cells. So they basically cling on to something that is considered an antigen, and then that attracts other cells to come back and eat it or kill it or destroy or render it bad or so that it doesn't work. B lymphocytes produce a protein called antibodies. They secrete those for humoral immunity. T cells are more cell-mediated immunity. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the immunity lecture that's coming up. But antibodies, also called immunoglobulins or abbreviated as IG, they're Y proteins, Y-shaped proteins created by the immune system to identify and neutralize foreign objects and antigens. So it's pretty cool. So that actually is a canine, a replica of a canine heartworm antibody. So it attaches to the heartworm essentially, and then renders it either unable to work or too big then to cross through. That's kind of basically how that system works. I also added a picture here, hematopoiesis that you see up here at figure 2. That is, poiesis means to make or generate or whatever. Hema is talking about blood. So general blood cell production from the bone marrow starts off with a hematopoietic stem cell that can turn into either of these things that you see here. Myeloid progenitor cells turns into white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets, and we talk about that a lot in hematology, but we don't talk about lymphoid progenitor cells as much, and those break down to be either T or B lymphocytes. Now, function 2 and 3, so the macrophages that are in the lymph nodes, so these specific cells that are white blood cells that are designed, they travel to the tissues or they travel to different areas. They are designed to engulf and break down or eat up, phagocytize any foreign invaders, or they remove those microorganisms. They also look for anything that is considered not self. So cells are marked a specific way by the body when they're created so that everything is known as self, or this is a good cell because it's self. As cells either age or become abnormal or diseased or anything like that, they get marked with a different protein that says this is not normal. Essentially, those other cells say this is not self. So then they find them and attack them and eat them or break them down. So waste materials, foreign material that gets in, cellular debris from different tissue metabolisms, it can also be broken down and removed as well. That's part of that filter action. Function 4, so those proteins that are larger, so enzymes and different blood proteins, etc., they are too big to go back into venous circulation. So now that you kind of understand that concept of the fluids coming out of the capillaries and going out by blood pressure, in by osmotic pressure, and washing those tissues. So we need proteins and things like that out there, but they're not going to go back in with that osmotic pressure because of their size. So the function number 4 is that they are large enough to filter into the lymph system, and those vessels are different sized and they can be taken up through the lymph nodes, etc., and then dropped back into the heart. Lymph is emptied into the vena cava, which vena cava is the large vein that goes towards the heart and ends up in that right atrium. And then it gets pumped and all that stuff, oxygenated by the lungs, blah, 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 and becomes blood again. So that happens in an area called the thoracic duct. I have put a little picture here on the bottom, shows some of those different lymph nodes, so some major vessels, etc. It's not all of them, obviously, it would be spiderwebbed throughout, but it's showing you where that thoracic duct is. So it's that larger area that will actually connects right there to that vena cava as it's going up towards the heart. So the thoracic duct. So at that point, lymph has come full circle. It originated in the plasma. It came out by blood pressure. It couldn't get back in by osmotic pressure. It does its job as interstitial fluid in the tissues, washing it, bringing it hormones, bringing it all good nutrients, etc. And even that waste product of those tissues gets absorbed back through the lymph. I think that's pretty cool. So it would go up through the lymph, be determined, this is a waste product, we don't need this back in our bloodstream, and removed, or anything that would be viral, bacterial, anything micro invaders or organisms as well. And then it's dropped back in at the level of the thoracic duct, emptied into the vena cava, and it has returned to plasma. So that is it as a full circle. So some characteristics of lymph. It is normally transparent or translucent. It's liquid. And it contains a varying number of different cells because of course it's going to be different things that are being picked up, but primarily lymphocytes since it's part of the lymph system and they're essentially created there, which I'll talk to you about that in just a second, how that works. So it is different technically than plasma. If you drew some out, it's not plasma, it is lymph. It has more water, it has more sugars or glucose, and it has more electrolytes going through there. It has fewer of the large proteins in plasma. So yes, it is able to take some of those proteins that were too big to get back through the capillaries, but some plasma proteins like albumin and different globulins, they actually couldn't get out in the first place because they were so big. So that is not going to be in lymph fluid. That's going to stay in plasma. Now, digestive system kind of has its own component, and lymph that is in the digestive area is called chyle, like, hey, Kyle, but it's C-H-Y-L-E. So it's interesting because this chyle, there's a condition called postprandial, which means post after, prandial after eating, lipemia, so where it becomes very fatty. So food from digestion or right after a meal, that comes in and out as well as a process of digestion. And then that gets picked up by the lymph or chyle because it's part of the digestive system, making it really lipemic looking. So microscopic fat particles from the digestion process are called chylomicrons. And therefore, sometimes, well, the blood as well, but the lymph especially can become really lipemic. So I put a little picture down there that's showing like clear see-through saline and then trace lipemic, hemolyzed, and then more and more lipemic all the way till, I mean, I've heard it called in practice strawberry milk. That's very lipemic. The picture above is showing that there is a semi-permeable membrane, and it's just kind of demonstrating that those molecules can essentially get through, but certain proteins cannot because of their size. So it just is giving you a visual that different compounds are smaller and shaped different, and that the proteins are these big yellow circles, and so they can't fit through this membrane. Now, there is a condition called chylothorax. So that is when the chyle that is in the lymph from the digestive system, it hasn't been filtered out. It hasn't gone through the whole tract to be cleared out of these chylomicrons, and it actually backs up. So it's considered a lymph drainage problem, and it backs up to the compartment essentially that's behind it, so which would be the chest cavity. So I have seen it only twice in practice, but it's fluid accumulation in the chest. And then when you chest tap and pull some out, it's usually this yellow fatty consistency. And so that would be called chylothorax. Okay, so that was part one with kind of how that all works and the different lymph and the circulation. Part two are the lymphoid organs. They can be broken down into two classifications. There's primary lymph organs, like the thymus, the bursa of Fabricius, which is birds only, and Peyer's patches, which is in multi-species like cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, and dogs. They're little aggregations of encapsulated tissues that are specific to the small intestine. Lining of the ileum, so is the primary location. You can see that on the picture that I've posted there for you. So it's tissue from lymph that is in the ileum, smaller percentage in the jejunum. And then secondary, your spleen, lymph nodes, and tonsils. So starting with those primary lymph organs, so the thymus, the malt, which is mucosa-associated lymph tissue, and that bursa of Fabricius. I think I'm saying that right. It's a bird thing. So primary lymph organs are unencapsulated. The thymus specifically is kind of the primary organ of the primary lymph organs. It's located within the cranial aspect of the thorax. So we talk about it in circulatory also, that there's that space in between the lungs. So the lungs aren't like big inflatable balloons. They're actually wrapped around the inside part, which has the heart, major vessels, the trachea goes down there. Essentially the esophagus does also, but there's like a compartment inside there. The thymus gland is right inside there above the heart. You can see its location on the picture. It's most prominent in young animals because it's so important in cell-mediated immune response, which I'll talk to you about that in just a second. But over time, as this immune system has built itself up and becomes more mature, the actual organ will atrophy and become covered in fat. So it's a lot harder to see. If you've taken diagnostic imaging, you know that we x-ray a lot of puppies, and a lot of them you'll be able to see the thymus because it's so prominent due to their age. That's pretty cool. Okay, so the thymus produces thymocytes. Remember, CYTE is cyte, which means cell, so thymus cells essentially. And it's produced because of precursors that are sent from the bone marrow. Remember how that previous picture of the hematopoiesis, that it said precursor cell, progenitor cell, essentially. So the bone marrow has those hematopoietic stem cells, which can change into progenitor cells for the lymph side, and then they can split into different things. So those precursors get sent to the thymus from the bone marrow, and there they'll end up becoming mature T cells. And after they're matured, they can rapidly divide and make more and more and more. And then those mature T cells leave the thymus and are able to travel to secondary lymphoid tissue to be there and to work as their little army of memory to protect our immune system. T cells are so important because they stimulate cell-mediated immune response. Cell-mediated immune response is detrimental to young animals because it's building the immune system and it's preventing infection, essentially. So they get microinvaders, they get viral things, they get bacteria, et cetera, something that can create some type of infection or abnormality, and they can break that down and get rid of it. So things that would be life-threatening for a young animal, those mature T cells that are produced from those thymocytes should be able to help that and keep them healthy and safe. A thymoma, so that is a tumor of the thymus. It's rare, usually benign, but it can grow in this thymus tissue because tumors can arise anywhere because the cells essentially something can go a little haywire and then they replicate and then it causes some type of tumor. Thymomas are sometimes associated with myasthenia gravis, which I have a slide on. I think it's the next slide, so we'll talk about that. Thymic carcinoma, so that's neoplasia or cancer of the thymus. And that usually happens in the thymic capsule, and then that could have a detrimental effect on that production of T cells. T cell actually stands for thymus derived. So here's just a little slide on myasthenia gravis. So sometimes it has to do with that tumor that I just talked about, the thymoma. Sometimes it can be an autoimmune disease. So autoimmune disease, auto means self. And so it's the immune system that has latched onto some type of normal cell that should be identified as self to the immune system, and it marks it as not self. And so then it starts attacking itself and causing problems. So myasthenia gravis is a rare, sometimes idiopathic, meaning the immune system just did it. And it's autoimmune, affecting skeletal muscle neuromuscular junction. You guys should totally understand that. We've talked about skeletal muscle. We've talked a lot about the neuromuscular junction. We've talked a lot about acetylcholine and how it has to be stimulated on the nerve side, sent across the synaptic cleft, right? And bind to its own receptors. So you can see down to the next point is that autoantibodies or antibodies against self that have been made by the immune system, they compete and they're pretty strong for the postsynaptic acetylcholine receptor. So if that receptor is being blocked by these autoantibodies, the actual acetylcholine that the brain is having the nerves released as a neurotransmitter, it has nowhere to go. Maybe it gets released normally, crosses the synaptic cleft normally, and it gets to its receptor and it's like, what the heck? So there's already someone sitting there and it can't do anything. So then it's just broken down by enzymes and recycled. That can lead to either delayed or absent nerve impulses to skeletal muscle. So basically a paralysis. a general paralysis, like you can see in this old labby here. So the brain is saying, get up and use your legs, but because of myasthenia gravis, the muscles are not contracting to be able to lift him up. So that's very sad. It can also happen focally or kind of like locally or in one spot. So that is sometimes this type of thing is related to mega esophagus. So I put this x-ray here where the muscle attachment, etc., of the esophagus, which is your food tube, isn't working. The stimulation isn't causing this contraction. So same type of thing. And then the digestive organs are kind of just stuck, stagnant, which is called a stasis. So when that stasis happens, the food can sit there. It can get rotten. It can cause like a choke type situation. It doesn't get absorbed properly in the stomach. You can see that bolus of food that's in the stomach on that x-ray. So that is not good. And, you know, there's different treatments and things that can be done for that, but that is how that works. So some of these associated lymph tissues that you need to know about is there's that bursa fabricius. It is a bird thing. It's found only in birds. It is a round sac that's located above the cloaca. So remember, the cloaca is kind of the everything hole of the bird. It's a similar in structure and function of the thymus that does also have a thymus. So it's not one or the other, but the bird, you can see this chicken here, has a thymus with the T cells, and then the bursa fabricius has B cells as well. So there's two kind of associated lymph tissues with those, and chickens are birds. Peyer's patches I had brought up, they are located on the wall of that small intestine, primarily the ileum, and they're part of the GULT, that gut-associated lymph tissue. Activate B cells to produce antibodies to antigens in the small intestine. So if you've ever heard that your gut is primarily where your immune system lives, that is partially true, yeah. So because nutrition happens there, all different absorption and things, the digestive tract is so important and vital to the body. Yeah, it's lined with lymph tissue, especially to make sure that these antigens or these bad guys or microinvaders or just anything that shouldn't be absorbed into the bloodstream either doesn't get absorbed, or if it does, it's latched onto it for destruction because it should be picked up as not self, if that makes sense. The next one over here is mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, referred to as MALT, because they're clusters of lymph tissue that are in different areas of the body, important areas of the body. So any mucosal surfaces, cult, that has to do with the conjunctiva. This picture here, there is conjunctiva lymph tissue, so the eye to process things. There's also lacrimal drainage associated lymph tissue. So all this conjunctiva or mucosal surfaces essentially have mucosa associated lymphatic tissue. NALT is nasopharynx. So it's talking about like your nose, breathing things in, right? We don't want microinvaders getting into our respiratory tract, as well as the pharynx, the throat. So we don't want to be swallowing things from the oral cavity of the mouth. So that's really important for our immune system. And then there's our gastro or gut associated lymph tissue with the GALT. So they all function to identify antigens and identify them as not self, and then mount the immune response. So the more that they attract, or the more that they, identify, the more that they can send out a warning, like a little army to other parts of the body or attach to it to get a stronger or weaker immune response, depending on what's needed. So that was for your primary stuff, your primary immune system or lymph organs. And now secondary lymph organs are your spleen, lymph nodes, and tonsils. So let's have a little lymph node 101. So lymph nodes are small kidney bean shaped filters, and they're located along lymphatic vessels. Remember that other picture? It kind of just showed one vessel through the abdomen, but it was a drawing. And I said, it would actually be spiderwebbed all throughout. There's tons of lymph vessels that run alongside all of the vessels because it has to be near them to be able to pick up that interstitial fluid. So at different points of the body, there are lymph nodes that are these little filters that are on these lymph vessels. The lymph node's main function is to trap the antigens and other foreign materials that are traveling and have been picked up by the lymph and process them to be removed before that lymph gets back to the bloodstream or systemic circulation. Lymph nodes, being those kidney bean shaped actual organs or filters, have two sections that have sinuses running through them. Sinuses means like a hole or a pathway. So when we talk about the sinuses, like nasal sinuses, there is a section in different parts that, I mean, when you're sick and you feel super congested, it's because those sinuses have filled up with purulent discharge or fluid or something backed up. So these are sinuses or compartments that are inside the lymph nodes. And so things can get in and out and be held there. So the cortex has lymph nodules, and you're going to see a picture of it in just a second, which have B cells. And the medulla has actual tissue macrophages, which are the eaty guys to be able to get them and break things down, as well as T cells. So these working together, that's how it filters and watches for anything that comes through that is considered not self. Lymph nodes are found all throughout the body. The peripheral lymph nodes are the superficial lymph nodes. Those are the ones that in a basic exam that you're feeling for, and they are paired. There's one on each side. Those are your number one is your submandibular, so sub under the mandible, your pre-scap or above the scapula, your axillary, which is the armpit pretty much, your inguinal, which is number 4 on this picture here, which is kind of the groin, and your popliteal, which is that back of the leg that's back there in the rear legs. But there are also internal lymph nodes that you can't feel necessarily or see. They are also considered the deep lymph nodes, and they are the hilar, which has to do with the kidney, mesenteric, which has to do with your GI tract, your sternal, which is towards the chest, your sublumbar or under the lumbar spine of the back, and the mediastinal, which is in the thorax. Oh, I have my note just to remind you, if you're taking notes here, that the T cells protect us from infection by breaking things down or rendering it unable. And B cells create antibodies and bind and either neutralize it or don't allow it to pass through. So here's a cool picture of a lymph node. I'm going to kind of just describe it here. So I'm going to start over on, it's my left, I think it's your left also, where it says afferent lymphatic vessel. So afferent, efferent, if you've taken some of my other classes, you've heard me say the very inappropriate thing of F off means go away. So EFF is your going away vessel, and then your afferent is going towards. So afferent lymph vessels, so these are the vessels of lymph that are flowing into the lymph node. And then you can see the sinuses in this kind of light pink color. It's called marginal sinus because margin means the edge, cortical sinus because it's in the cortex. So that all can kind of be broken down and make sense. So you can see those sinuses that go through to the medullary sinus or right in the medulla. It shows an artery and a vein here because it's tissue and it has to get nutrients, etc., oxygen and whatnot. The yellow are germinal centers, so there's different macrophages and stuff there. Let's see. The blue is showing you that those are mostly T cells. And then the red are macrophages and plasma cells also to break things down. So this is just kind of overall how it looks. And then your efferent lymph vessel to let it continue on its way once it's passed through the filter. So fact about lymph nodes, all secondary lymph organs enlarge in response to antigenic stimulation. So those secondary lymph organs that I said we're going to talk about in this one, that spleen, the tonsils, the lymph nodes, they respond in antigenic stimulation. So remember, antigenic stimulation is something that is not self, whether it's a microinvader, autoimmune, etc. So lymph fluid flows through at least one peripheral or superficial lymph node as it returns from the limbs. And inside the body, or deeper inside the body, lymph flows through at least one deep lymph node after draining organs as well. It all flows all through there to take that tissue stuff and add lymphocytes and get things and give things and make it all pretty. So lymph from specific areas of the body, it's a track. It always flows and passes through those same nodes. So that's why feeling for these lymph nodes and either having some or all can mean different things. So that can sometimes aid in determining the location of inflammatory responses, infections, tumors, or something going on. In ultrasound, they can find, even sometimes x-ray, even can find some enlarged deep lymph nodes, and that might give the doctor a clue also. I have a picture of a Doberman up here with extremely visually enlarged submandibular lymph nodes. So this situation actually happened to be an abscessed tooth. So this lymph node that drains through the head and neck, so the infection that being absorbed into the bloodstream and the plasma, et cetera, it's being filtered out or trying to, and it's enlarging because of how much stimulation from these antigens or how much not self that these lymph nodes are finding. I have a picture down here of deep lymphatic drainage. So it's showing you those deep locations and how that pattern is where it's going to, you can kind of see how it would drain different areas. If an internal or deep lymph node is extremely inflamed, sometimes it can get through to the outer one and you could potentially see an inflamed or enlarged lymph node that's peripheral that could potentially mean something internal also. So kind of. Some superficial ones, the ones you feel during your exam, there's a little cool chart here that shows the different areas that drains as well as lymph passes through it. I'm going to reference the textbook. There's a little clinical application that I think will help. So if you don't have your book, pause me and go grab your book. If you do, open to page 314 of your A&P textbook. And right there on the left, underneath secondary lymphoid organs, is a clinical application about swollen lymph nodes. Basically, it's talking about, so if there's an infection in some part of the body, microorganism to blame can be picked up by lymph vessel, carried to lymph nodes, since we know that they're filters. And as that lymph passes through the lymph node, the tissue macrophages that live inside there, they'll attempt to remove it. So they'll kind of grab it, they'll try to engulf it, and that causes the a different activity. And like I said before, that depending on how much is going on can stimulate even a higher immune response or lower. So that is going to cause macrophages to get more active. The lymph node becomes larger as a result of the multiplication of the lymphocytes, because remember, lymphocytes can clone themselves and split up and divide, especially in a time of the body being attacked. And then that is also, this immune response is going to call in, it's going to send out the signal for more macrophages to come to the area and help them eat everything up and fight everything. Remember, macrophages are essentially mostly they're white blood cells that have left the bloodstream to become warriors of eating microinvaders. Some lymph nodes are located close to the surface. Peripheral lymph nodes are superficial of the body and can be palpated or felt through the skin. If they're responding to an infection in their drainage area, we've talked about that, they will become larger and more readily palpated. If enlarged, lymph nodes can be used as a clue to the location of the infection, and you may be familiar with the mandibular lymph nodes just behind each side of your jaw and the neck. And these are the glands that swell up when you have a cold. And this is because the mandibular lymph nodes, or submandibular, are not true glands. They're nodes and tissues, drain the nasal cavity, mouth, and pharynx. So that cold virus, etc., has been identified as not self, and your body is fighting it. So I thought that was just another important example to go over. All right, so there's some important terms, some breakdown of medical terminology. The term for enlarged lymph nodes, just in general, is lymphadenomegaly. So lymph, obviously referring to lymph. Adeno has to do with gland, and megaly means to be enlarged. So it's literally saying lymph node is enlarged. The general term for a disease affecting the lymph node is lymphadenopathy. Opathy, remember that's the suffix for meaning disease. So lymph node disease. When this happens or something is swollen and we need to identify it, a fine needle aspirate or an FNA can be drawn to collect cells and a cytology done to evaluate for abnormalities. And this is actually a checkoff in, I don't think you guys do lymph nodes per se, but an FNA is a checkoff for your lab procedures class. So you'll get some practice doing that. So an FNA of a lymph node is going to collect those little cells and then go on a slide and be identified for abnormalities. And apparently I'm having technical difficulties. Let me fix this really quick. Still says recording, so I'm hoping it didn't cut anything out. It doesn't look like my screen is being shared, so let me fix that again. That was weird. Okay, it looks like we're back in business. So I was talking about fine needle aspirate, how it collects these cells and then the cytology can be done and looking for abnormalities. So increased number of lymphocytes, cancer cells, all kinds of stuff. So if a single or a few lymph nodes are enlarged, some of those differential diagnosis can be metastasis of a nearby malignancy or some type of cancer, right? Even internally, like I said, it can affect the lymph nodes as it goes through. Local or regional infectious diseases or inflammatory processes. So IBD, so irritable bowel disease, can cause a problem. Gastroenteritis, E. coli infection, so that's severe bacterial. Hepatitis, inflammation of the liver. Valley fever, so that's a disseminated fungal infection. Severe skin infection, pancreatitis, so angry pancreas. Prostatitis, so an intact male dogs. I mentioned before the tooth abscess. So I also have seen it in severe skin conditions. I think I've talked to you guys about the dog I tried to rescue with the very severe skin issues. She had enlarged lymph nodes because the bacteria, her skin was broken, which is a barrier for the immune system. So it was constantly fighting something, which was ultimately part of why she didn't make it. I also was going to mention, I was going to mention that I had a indoor-outdoor cat and he did this coughing thing all the time and we took x-rays and Dr. Green, who used to be, he just retired, an internist happened to be there and he was looking at my x-rays I was taking and he pointed out that there was a specific cervical lymph node that was huge and it was actually pushing the trachea up. And he said to test for valley fever because he sees that classically in valley fever. And sure enough, the kitty had valley fever, which is kind of rare in cats, but it's my life. It's a vet tech life, isn't it? So generalized lymphadenomegaly, or all of the peripheral lymph nodes being enlarged, could mean some type of disseminated infection, so traveling and becoming systemic, or inflammatory process, of course. One example of that is puppy strangles, which I have a picture here that's talking about how the process of puppy strangles, and it's talking about almost 2 weeks into it, the puppy had alopecia, edema, crusting, and enlarged lymph nodes. So that's how that works, as well as lymphoma. So that would be cancer of it. And I have a slide here to go over that. So yeah, so lymphoma, sometimes called lymphosarcoma, is cancer essentially or neoplasia of the lymph system, lymph nodes. Some of the things that happen in the body with this or that you may see or the process of lymphoma, peripherally, there will be multiple enlarged PLNs, so peripheral lymph nodes. On histology, there's going to be a large population of intermediate and large lymphocytes. I have this picture here. So this would be a cytology from an FNA. So the lymphocytes, you can see more normal sized ones. There's a lot of them here trying to solve the problem. And then there's some small ones. The order of lymphopoiesis, you should know this if you've taken hematology, but the order of how it goes, the earlier it is in the blood marrow, the larger the cell is. As it becomes more mature, it gets a little bit smaller. And then when it comes out to peripheral circulation or the bloodstream, it's what we consider a normal size for the bloodstream. So if all of those are being used up and the body's like, we need help, send more lymphocytes. So what's going to happen is it's going to get that message, and the bone marrow is going to try to spit them out faster. So it's going to spit them out not as mature as it normally would. So they'll appear larger and larger in some type of histology sample. So that's what it's saying, is that they're being used up so fast that immature or more immature lymphocytes are being sent into circulation. And that's that order of lymphopoiesis. The younger the cell is, the larger it is. Internally, the spleen, which we're going to talk about in just a second, is going to be generally enlarged, splenomegaly. It also can have this mottled or leopard spot appearance on ultrasound. So I don't know if my face is covering it. I'll move it just in case. So you can see this is an ultrasound of the spleen. The spleen is this darker area above, and you can see how it has tiny little dots. And so that is that leopard print, what it's talking about, of where it's very irritated and inflamed and not doing well on ultrasound. Renally, or kidneys, unilateral kidney enlargement, because remember, we have some of those lymph tissues there as well. Hepatic is generalized enlarged, which is called hepatomegaly, so the liver itself. Cutaneous, epitheliotropic, so there can be some outer skins of the epithelial tissue, because there's lymph tissue there in the skin, because the skin is part of the immune system. It's the barrier of the body. Pretty much anywhere lymph tissue is found is going to be enlarged, angry, trying to fight off this lymphoma, which is the neoplasia, or these abnormal cells that have proliferated so much it's created a cancer. These are pictures actually that Dr. Jordan had in here from when she was in practice on a lymphoma patient. So this patient here, you can see those submandibular lymph nodes. Oh, yikes. This one shows her squeezing that prescapular lymph node. Here we have the popliteal lymph nodes being shown. Popliteal as well. And it also even causes the tissues in and around the eye, like I mentioned, those mucosal associated lymph tissues, to cause problems. That's actually hyphema, which is blood in the anterior chamber of the eye. So unfortunately, not a successful outcome due to the prognosis of how far along this had gotten. Now, the spleen 101, the spleen is the largest lymph system organ, and it is a tongue-shaped organ located on the left side of the abdomen. Here it's circled in yellow. It literally looks like a big gross tongue. It's near the stomach in simple stomached animals, so you can see its location on the dog drawing here. And it's near the rumen in ruminants, so it is blue on this image of the cow here. Outside of it is covered with a capsule of really fibrous connective tissue, as well as smooth muscle. And the smooth muscle has a really important job when it comes to the spleen. So there is a term here, trabeculae or trabecula, which are branches of this outer capsule, this fibrous tissue, remember, and this really important smooth muscle that goes down into the soft tissue portion of the spleen. You can see the capsule is that pinkish color on the outside. You can see the trabecula that is fingering, making its little pathway down into the soft tissue of the spleen in this picture. And it's full of smooth muscle as well as vessels and other stuff as well. And the cells can contract, and it actually can squeeze blood out of the spleen and back into circulation. Why would it need to do that? Well, I'm going to tell you. So the spleen is made up of two different colored pulps, the white pulp and the red pulp. So the white pulp has immunologic functions, so very specific to the immune system, and it has phagocytic cells, or those macrophages, that can react to antigens in the bloodstream. Lymphocytes can clone. Remember I mentioned that. So the lymphocytes, when they feel attacked, so there's a lot of them going on in the spleen and the stored blood. So they can actually clone and make more separately from like the bone marrow precursor, which is pretty cool. So that's in the white pulp. On the picture, you can see the white pulp is literally white with these little dots. There's an artery, so it's directly getting blood. Okay, and then it has some circles of white pulp throughout, which is considered specific lymphoid tissue. You can see the let me move my face. The trabecula, let me move my face out of the way. And then blood sinuses, and then these red pulp. So red pulp, macrophages, so specific, you see their little smiley faces, those are macrophages, and they're floating around looking for things that need to be removed or destroyed. And that's not always just microinvaders. So there's a process of blood cells. Blood cells have a lifespan. Red blood cells especially, they have a shorter lifespan. It changes, varies for different species, but it's actually 120 days for dogs. And as they age, they start not being able to do their job correctly. So they'll change, and it's a process called senescence. So these senescent, which is SENESCENT. So these senescent, or these aging blood cells, will then produce a protein that says, "It is my time, take me." And as they get through the spleen is going to go ahead and remove them, break them down. We'll talk about how that works in hematology a lot. Cells make me super excited. But basically, it's removed by these macrophages at that time. It can also remove other things, but these macrophages are specifically in the red pulp, which you can see in between the white pulp outside of the capsule, and obviously not in the same as the trabecula. All right, so the spleen, talking about squeezing that blood and why it would do that. So the spleen is actually a reservoir for blood. So it has some storage spaces within it that the blood flows through, etc. Now, when an animal is at rest, so basically not needing blood to be pumped faster, its muscles don't need oxygen and nutrients pumped through, the brain doesn't even need anything extra, it's totally at rest. So when that happens, the spleen actually gets larger and those storage spaces fill with blood. That's called the splenic reservoir. That can actually make the spleen enlarge completely, and the blood can kind of chill there and stay healthy and keep all these nutrients, etc. Now, when the blood pressure goes up, the body needs excess blood cells. Anything specific to that trabecula can contract. Remember how their fingers down in the spine and they're full of that smooth muscle? Therefore, it's able to essentially squeeze that whole spleen. The spleen gets smaller because those splenic reservoirs that were filled with blood, they're sending it back to the bloodstream to be used. So the spleen can enlarge when it's storing blood. It can enlarge when there's some type of infection or it's being filled up with macrophages and lymphocytes to fight an infection. And then it can get smaller when it contracts to send these blood cells back out, or even when the blood cells need to be sent out to more lymphocytes that have cloned themselves to send out to circulation. The term for enlargement of the spleen is splenomegaly. Remember, megaly is enlarged. The spleen is actually not essential for life, even though I've just explained how important it is and how it does all these awesome things, but it can be removed. So a mass on the spleen or a cancer of the spleen isn't always a complete death sentence if it's caught early. It can be surgically removed, called a splenectomy. I've seen lots and lots of those done for various reasons. On this x-ray up here, you can actually see a giant mass that's on the spleen. It's labeled for you. I know x-rays can be a bit confusing. The picture of surgery is showing, oh my gosh, it is a giant splenic tumor. Some common malignancies of the spleen, if it's a tumor or cancer of the red pulp, which is the outside, remember, it's called a hemangiosarcoma, and that is very vascular and very angry and not good. And then lymphoma, which we just talked about, is essentially from the white pulp. So that would spread through and make all of those lymph nodes enlarged and everything that we talked about previously when we discussed lymphoma. Now, the spleen can rupture. So I've seen splenic masses that have ruptured just getting so huge, and it actually bursts, the mass bursts, which is connected to the spleen, or the spleen kind of bursts, and that is going to cause a massive blood flow to the abdomen. So that's called hemoabdomen, where the animal's abdomen actually is going to look inflated and filled with fluid. Because that blood that's flowing through the spleen and is emptying into the abdomen, they're going to have white gums. Sometimes they'll collapse because the blood isn't being pumped correctly throughout the body for circulation. So that's usually how you see them, is pale white gums, a collapse, and a distended fluidy abdomen. The doctor will probably have you or assist with, depending on where you work and if you're a CVT. But a abdominocentesis, which is a tap of the abdomen. So you can see that picture down there, and it would be blood. And so typically they do that because it could be lymph fluid, it could be chyle that's filled up there, could be air. I mean, it wouldn't feel fluidy, but it could be blood, which would be called a hemoabdomen. The spleen itself can rupture due to trauma, like a hit by car. A lot of times there's hemoabdomen from a ruptured spleen, which would still require a splenectomy. The tonsils. All right, move my little face because I don't know if it's blocking your picture like it is on my screen. So the tonsils are nodules of lymph tissue because it's these secondary organs not covered with a capsule, so unencapsulated, found in epithelial surfaces all over the body, and it actually, mature lymphocytes live there. So remember when we talked about them cloning themselves and going to secondary tissues, they can travel to the tonsils, be ready to fight any infection that they come across. So you're probably most familiar with the pharyngeal region. So if you stick when you're sick, your tonsils get super swollen. If you've had strep throat, your tonsils are red and angry and have white spots all over them. So that's the most common one that is kind of talked about with the tonsils. And obviously lymph tissue is really important to be in the throat, right? You have general oral cavity bacteria. Dogs and cats and some people aren't brushing their teeth as often as they are supposed to, tooth infections, maybe they ate something that's bad, anything that just is entering the body by way of the oral cavity. So there needs to be a lot of lymph tissue up there being prepared. So besides the tonsils of the throat, there are other tonsils in the body. There are some in the larynx. There are some in the intestines, so protecting the GI tract, but as well as the reproductive system. So there are actually some tonsils in the prepuce of the penis and the vagina. So, I mean, we talk about it in every class, right? Eating and nutrition is super important for survival. Reproduction is super important. So obviously those are the areas the body wants to protect with immune tissue. I think the last slide here is just kind of comparing tonsils to lymph nodes because they can get very confusing. Tonsils are found close to moist epithelial surfaces, and lymph nodes go along lymph vessels throughout the whole lymph system as filters. Tonsils are found at the beginning of lymph drainage systems where things are absorbed and kind of starting the track. And lymph nodes are entire regions of the body. So they're within. So it can be multiple in a whole region, not just the start of one. And tonsils are unencapsulated. There is no capsule. And lymph nodes are encapsulated, meaning they have a capsule. So just a picture down here of those submandibular lymph nodes. Here's a drawing and a picture of the oral tonsils of the throat or the pharynx. You can see that tissue of what that would look like looking down there in an actual patient. So that's pretty cool. All right, that is the end of this. Here's some other good pictures for you. So blood capillaries intertwined, tissue cells intertwined with lymph vessel capillaries and how it's going to take it into these larger vessels and travel this whole system, fighting infection, making it fresh and clean and putting stuff back in the plasma. So I hope you enjoyed.